Hello, I'm Father Anthony Cicada. One disputed question in traditionalist circles, particularly among sedevacantists, concerns the 1955 Holy Week reforms of Pope Pius XII. On one side are priests like myself, who maintain that these reforms paved the way for the 1969 New Order of Mass of Paul VI, and were the work of the same sneaky modernist cabal that concocted the post-Vatican II reforms. For these reasons, we don't believe that we're bound by them, so we use the pre-1955 Holy Week and Missal. On the other side are priests and laymen who say, "Whoa, Pius XII was a true pope. You can't ignore his liturgical laws. You're obliged to follow them no matter what. Otherwise, you're rejecting Pius XII's authority."
The Pope can do whatever he wants. Okay, that's principle one. He is not bound to law. He's above canon law. He can do whatever he wants.
Liturgical laws that were objectively good and obligatory when they were promulgated, I've shown, are like any other ecclesiastical law. They can become harmful and cease to bind years later due to changed circumstances. This is a general principle all canonists recognize, because a human legislator, even a pope, cannot foresee all possible future situations. But some priests just keep rattling on about disobedience.
The pre-55 partisans do not hold that the liturgical legislation of Pius XII was harmful in itself. Instead, they argue that it became harmful years later and therefore no longer binds. The cessation of law is a valid principle. However, Father Cicada fails to demonstrate exactly how it has become harmful. If you are going to disregard the liturgical legislation of the Supreme Pontiff, the burden of proof is on you. You must show exactly how the liturgy that was not harmful while Pius XII was alive suddenly became harmful after his death. So what evidence does he have to offer?
One general principle in church law is that a law is supposed to have an element of stability or perpetuity to it. That a law that is a law that the church promulgates can be changed by another lawgiver somewhere down the road. There's no question about that. But the law itself has to have this element of what's called perpetuity or stability to it. What you find when you look at the documentation about the 1955 changes is that it was viewed very clearly as transitional.
I had not too long ago an internet discussion with Mr. Cisco, and not to get into the details of it, but I said, please show me texts from pre-Vatican II theologians which support your claim that we can sift the magisterium, that we can reject, that you don't have ordinary universal magisterium unless you have what is known as temporal continuity, that is continuity over time. Please show me theologians that support that, because I have never ever seen that in any book.
What evidence do these pre-55 partisans have to offer? When Father Cicada wants to disregard papal legislation, he tells us that there is a principle in law that a law must have perpetuity. But when the recognize and resist argue that they can sift the Pope's teachings on the grounds that a law must have continuity over time, suddenly they have never heard of such a principle. When an argument serves their purposes, there is a principle in law. When it does not serve their purposes, they demand, where is that written? It is more than a little hypocritical to condemn the recognize and resist traditionalists when you are doing that very same thing yourself. That is, they recognize Pius XII as a valid pope, but they resist his liturgical reforms, and they will criticize their opponent for not quoting theologians to support their case, and then turn around and do that very same thing themselves. So what evidence does Father Cicada have to offer? Rather than citing theologians, instead he chooses to contact the dead.
One St. Patrick's Day, I was mulling over my Pius XII Holy Week file, and I wondered aloud, what would Pope Pius XII tell me to do? He was the legislator, after all. I wish I could go back, present him with the evidence, and ask him if I'd still be bound by it all. Well, sure enough, it being St. Paddy's Day, a contingent of leprechauns bearing green cupcakes and a time travel pistol arrived at my office door to grant my wish. "We've heard your reverence would like to take his case to the angelic pastor himself," one of them said, as they presented the cupcakes. "So here you go," he said, aiming his time travel pistol at me. "Back to 1957 with you, to His Holiness's own office." Suddenly, there I was, before the austere and dignified, but somewhat surprised, figure of Pius XII. The pontiff maintained his composure, even after I explained I'd arrived from the year 2018 by time machine. "Another American gadget," he opined.
Rather than citing theologians to support his case, Father Cicada instead chooses to contact the dead. No doubt Father Cicada was only using time travel as a rhetorical device. Nevertheless, it presents a distorted way of determining doctrine, whether by time machine or Ouija board. A Catholic does not determine their doctrine by contacting the dead.
Could I then ask Your Holiness a few questions about the Holy Week reforms you just promulgated in 1955? It seems that they eventually led to a few problems in the liturgy that Your Holiness didn't foresee. Such as? Well, the men who worked on them had a secret agenda. It's all in my file here. As the years went by, they used your reforms to justify more and more radical changes in the Mass. 15 years later, by 1969, Latin was abolished, altars were replaced with bare tables, tabernacles were removed from the sanctuary, transubstantiation was no longer mentioned, women served as lectors. But what do the later sacrileges of Montini have to do with our Holy Week reforms?
The answer is they have absolutely nothing to do with the 55 Holy Week reform. Instead of making the necessary distinctions, they conflate Pius XII's reform with the Novus Ordo, as if they were one and the same. This allows them to avoid the actual issues. They will just dismiss whatever argument might be raised by saying that it is just the Novus Ordo Holy Week. They have already decided to reject Pius XII's reform, and this tactic allows them to avoid the argument.
But surely, at least the experts who were in charge of my Holy Week reforms were solid men. Like that smart young Vincentian, what's his name, Father Bugnini. Alas, Your Holiness, in 1975, Bugnini was unmasked as a Mason. This explains why he wrote that the process of liturgical change during your reign would, quote, require the enlightened collaboration of all the active forces, unquote. È vero? Massone? Well, then the brilliant Father Jungmann. We have his book right here on our desk. He was part of the conspiracy, too.
They argue that the liturgical legislation of Pius XII was the work of the same sneaky cabal who brought us the Novus Ordo. But a liturgy does not gain its force of law because of the holiness of the men who wrote it. It gains its binding authority because the Pope is the supreme legislator, who has been promised the assistance of the Holy Ghost. Pope St. Pius X addressed to the priests of the Apostolic Union, quote, when one loves the Pope, one does not call his orders into doubt on the pretext easily advanced by whoever does not wish to obey, that they emanate not directly from him, but from his entourage.
When he promulgated his new Mass in 1969, Your Holiness, Montini stated that your Holy Week reforms were the first step towards the adaptation of the Roman Missal to the sensitivities of this new age. He associated us with this? Our reforms were the first step? We had no idea. But you are not saying that our own reforms were evil in themselves, are you? Of course not, Your Holiness. But for us to continue to use your Holy Week, after what Paul VI did to the Mass, gives a false legitimacy to his later reform. The camel's nose in the tent. Capiamo. We understand. People ask, if you take the nose, why not take the whole camel?
No one can deny that Pius XII's liturgical reform is orthodox, so they must change the argument. They do a bait and switch. They argue that these changes, while not harmful in themselves, would eventually lead to the Novus Ordo. These pre-55 partisans suggest that if Pius XII had never made changes to Holy Week, then the Novus Ordo Mass would have never happened. But there are more than a few problems with this thesis. Arguing what change led to what abuse at some point in the future is a slippery slope. The Church has always made changes to her liturgy. Once one accepts the slippery slope reasoning, they could just as easily argue that the breviary reform of Pope St. Pius X eventually led to the Novus Ordo. Or they could even argue that Pope St. Pius X's lowering the age to receive communion eventually led to communion in the hand. This kind of reasoning allows one to reject just about anything they don't like. Once you reject the Pope as your rule of faith, each priest can just pick and choose the liturgy that he feels best feeds his faith. The result is liturgical anarchy.
Some priests just keep rattling on about disobedience.
If the Pope promulgates a liturgical rite, Catholics are bound to accept it. It is a matter of authority. What an individual cleric or layman thinks has no relevance. The only relevant questions are, was Pius XII a valid pope, and were his reforms orthodox?
There's nothing in the Pius XII changes that would be contrary to faith or offensive to faith.
A priest would only be allowed to reject Pius XII's liturgical reforms if there were something in them that were contrary to the faith. However, a valid pope cannot promulgate a harmful liturgy. Therefore, if one were to show that the 55 liturgical reforms were not orthodox, it would follow that Pius XII was not a valid pope, and if he were not a valid pope, one must reject not just his Holy Week reforms, but everything that he promulgated.
But we do have the facts before us. Bugnini, the great architect of the liturgical revolution, told us that the Pius XII reforms were a bridge between the old and the new that led to a new city.
It is absurd to suggest that the Novus Ordo would have never happened if only Pius XII had not reformed the Holy Week liturgy.
If you think that the last missal of the last true pope should be the last word on the form of the liturgy you want to last forever, fine, and you're welcome to it.
If you think that the last missal of the last true pope should be the last word on the form of the liturgy, you obviously did not get your theological training in a cone. The divisions over the 55 liturgy have their roots in the errors of Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre's Society of St. Pius X. The society acknowledged Paul VI as their legitimate pope, and yet they rejected his new Mass. The seminary at Icone divorced the authority of the pope from the liturgy. But if you're not going to use the missal of your pope, what missal would you use?
It was, yes, a mixed bag. I would say it was something that resembled a seminary perhaps of 1963 or 64. There were elements of the traditional and there were elements of the new. For example, they used 4 missals to say a low Mass, because the priest started at the altar, and then he said the introit at the cedilla, which was typical of the coming Novus Ordo, or then it was already in vigor. Then they moved over to a pulpit and read they said the introit at the cedilla. The epistle they read to the people at a pulpit, and then they crossed over to another pulpit and read the gospel toward the people, and then he finally ended up back at the altar, where he used the 4th missal, and there they left out the last gospel, and they actually put up only 2 altar cards because they weren't saying the last gospel, so it looked rather odd. So you had this hybrid traditional Mass. It was not a John the 23rd traditional Mass. You would never have recognized it. It was a 1964-65 version of the traditional Mass, but it was in Latin.
Without the Pope as their ultimate authority, what then would be their guide? It seems that there was not one single missal that was enforced at Icone. At least initially, priests were given some degree of latitude as to which liturgy they would use. Some priests used the 62 Missal of John the 23rd, while others adopted the pre-55 Missal that existed before the reforms of Pius XII.
When I arrived at Acon, I was told that the English-speaking provinces of the Society of St. Pius X used the pre-John the 23rd Missal, and that the non-English-speaking parts, especially the French areas, used the early changes of 60 and 62, and that this was actually explicitly agreed upon. I was told that the leadership of the society at that point, ultimately Archbishop Lefebvre, had agreed that in the English-speaking world that the priests would use the pre-John the 23rd liturgy. It was actually the pre-1955-54 that endured all the way to 1982.
The Sede Vacantis position holds that the chair of Peter is currently vacant, and therefore they maintain the liturgy as it was upon the death of the last valid pope. But the Society of St. Pius X does not hold that the pope is the final authority on the liturgy. They examine the liturgy to determine whether it is in agreement with tradition. To the Society, the liturgy is not safe just because the pope promulgated it. The liturgy is only safe when it conforms with their concept of tradition. Therefore, they sift the Pope's legislation and determine for themselves which parts meet their standards and disregard the rest. This was the poisonous mindset that was developed at Acon. Eventually, Archbishop Lefebvre settled on the 1962 Missal of John the 23rd. The choice of the 62 Missal served several objectives. First, it reined in the liturgical diversity that existed in the Society of St. Pius X, and second, it signaled a kind of tacit acceptance of the Second Vatican Council in an attempt to work out some kind of arrangement with Rome.
But we were told that we had to switch from the pre-John the 23rd breviary, and we had to accept the early changes in the praying of the breviary. And I spoke with Archbishop Lefebvre about this, and I said, Monsignor, the next logical step is going to be require that we take the 1962 changes of John the 23rd, because the divine office and the Mass should coincide. They should be harmonized with each other. So, this will leave us adopting the John the 23rd changes in the breviary, but not the changes in the Mass. And he said, no, just the divine office for the time being. And that's as far as he would go. Well, sure enough, within the year, Monsignor Lefebvre returned and said, now I need you to accept the 1962 changes in the Mass also. We found out later that the real reason for these changes was that Monsignor Lefebvre was involved in negotiations with the Vatican, with the modernists in the Vatican. There were 3 cardinals who had been appointed to meet with Archbishop Lefebvre and try to work out some kind of an arrangement, which ultimately was called a protocol, so that the modernists in the Vatican could recognize the Society of St. Pius X. St. Pius X Society would recognize the legitimacy of the modernists in the Vatican. Among the terms of that rapprochement between the two was that the society accept the early changes of John the 23rd, I guess as a token of goodwill or something.
After the 9 priests were expelled from the Society of St. Pius X for refusing to use the 1962 Missal, they started a seminary where they trained new priests to be Sede Vacantis. They recognized Pius XII as the last valid pope, and yet they resist his liturgical legislation. This is the one thing that the pre-55 partisans have in common with the SSPX. The society does not look to the man they believe to be the current pope to decide what liturgy they will use, and likewise, these pre-55 partisans also do not look to the last valid pope to decide what liturgy they will use. Recognize and resist may have started in Acon, but these 9 priests who were expelled from the SSPX have now spread it throughout the Sede Vacantis world. You can take the priest out of Acon, but it is a little harder to take Acon out of the priest. Catholic Crusader Films is solely responsible for the content of this video.